This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for anyone who loves learning and wants to explore their creativity and learn new skills. A subscriber requested for me to paint something with a metal surface, which is something that I'm not very good at, so I turned to Skillshare to look for classes on this topic. I came across the artist JW Learning, who has made a series of basic fundamentals of art like values, color theory, relations in color, and many others. I ended up doing quite a long marathon watching his classes because they were filled with so much valuable information, one of them being how to paint reflective surfaces, metal, leather, glass, and chrome. And this is the class that I took in order to study before creating this tutorial. This class is so jam-packed with information from understanding the surfaces and how it reflects the surroundings to colors and of course execution of painting different reflective surfaces. It was broken down in such a way to help you visualize the layering process that's important to notice when painting these surfaces, and I find this very fascinating. The artist demonstrated his illustration digitally, but this kind of knowledge is something that you'd be able to bring across to any medium. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description box will get a month free trial of Skillshare. Invest in yourself and your personal growth with Skillshare. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Hi everyone, this is Nia. So this is the metal surface item that I chose to attempt painting as one of you requested. Honestly, I'm not good at the theory behind it either, which is why I took the Skillshare class to at least learn a little bit about it before painting this, so hopefully this somewhat makes sense to you guys. I'm going to start out by sketching out the kettle. As you can see, I first drew out a rectangle, and this is to give an estimation to the size and the position of the kettle. As you guys know, I'm not good at drawing out even sides, and if I focus too much on that, a lot of times the position of the item itself won't be centered, and this actually happened to me a few times already, which is why I decided to use the guideline. In terms of the kettle itself, I tried to simplify the shape by drawing out rectangles and flat shapes and then adding the curves later so you can adjust the angle of view. The design of the kettle is something that I made up. I just looked at copper kettles on Pinterest and there were so many photos, but I ended up just making up my own shapes using some elements from other images, and I came up with this one. As for the color later, I use a separate reference image to help me with the reflection of the kettle. Once I'm satisfied with the main shapes and the placement, now I'm going to add the curves on those straight lines to give more of a dimension instead of it looking flat. I also want to add a bit of details to the lid, so I made a double layer. I also made the side face of the handles visible, and this makes a huge difference in the form of the overall kettle. Because you can see where the spout connects to the body of the kettle, that means we can see more of the left side of the kettle. So I want the left side of the handle to be visible, whereas I can see the inner part of the handle on the right hand side. Same goes for the top section. I want to create a full composition for this one, so at the bottom of the kettle I want to add a cloth napkin. I'm also going to complete this one with a background. To add more movement and interest to the painting, I want the cloth napkin to have folds, so I just make curved lines on the side where the side is visible, and I try to connect it together with straight lines to create the layers. Lastly here, I'm just going to fix up the shape of the spout, and next I'll go over the colors. So here are the colors I'll be using. Firstly, this is Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Indigo by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Grey of Grey by Holbein, Tough Titanium by Daniel Smith, and Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. So let's paint. Firstly, I'm going to create the background. I'm going to use a mix of gray with indigo, crimson lake, and Jaune brilliant dark to neutralize the color. As you can see, I separated the darker tone where it had more crimson lake and indigo on the left, whereas on the right hand side and at the bottom is where I mix up a thinner consistency, and I also added buff titanium there. I always do this because I want different but similar tones to be easily accessible, and this way I can alternate as I paint. The way I'm applying the paint is to make small brush strokes, and sometimes I also add water to certain areas, so some parts are a bit darker, some parts are a bit lighter. And at times I also just make brush strokes in random places and then connect them together later on. This way I create something that is a bit more textured and streaky, because we've given those streaks a bit of time to dry, and then I will add on the paint later so they won't just blend together. For areas surrounding the handle, because the handle is fairly thin, I want to make sure that the edges are a bit more defined. So I just glazed on a little bit more paint. For this I used buff titanium, but it's up to you which tone you want to pick from. Next, I'm going to start to paint the kettle. I'm going to first use a mix of New Gamboge, Jaune Brilliant Dark, and Crimson Lake. I'm basically going to paint one section at a time, and I'm going to start with the bottom of the neck of the kettle. I'm going to use this to create a base color. Then I'm going to add Sepia, Crimson Lake, and New Gamboge to add the details underneath, and just play around with a different variation of the colors for now. This is the reference image that I ended up choosing. I like the fact that the surface looks kind of uneven, so the reflection of the surrounding area looks a bit more abstract. However, as I painted later, I think I overdid it with the wavy reflection, so it didn't end up looking as shiny. So you can make the lines a bit straighter or even completely straight if you would like, depending on the type of surface you want your kettle to be. So just keep that in mind for your own painting. So here I wanted to follow roughly the area of the highlight, and I like the fact that the highlight color is a bit yellow in comparison to the copper. And I started out by sketching a few areas, and then I'll paint it on so I can build the reflections from there. In terms of the color, I use a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark with New Gamboge, and at the bottom of one of the highlighted areas I added more New Gamboge, so there's a slight gradation. For the mixture of the midtone of the copper, I use a mix of Crimson Lake, New Gamboge, and Jaune Brilliant Dark. And as for the darker tone, I use Sepia, New Gamboge, and Crimson Lake. What I'm trying to do here is to basically use variations of those two color mixtures to create random reflections. As I mentioned before, I'm making wavy lines to create the slight uneven surface, but you can change this up to paint straight lines in different weights, or maybe less wavy lines in comparison to what I'm doing here. Metal surfaces are highly reflective, and it reflects the surrounding area. In a studio setting, I would assume that the reflection would be more controlled and cleaner, whereas I feel like this photo was taken in a semi-outdoor area because I can see bits of skylight and slight greeneries with what I'm guessing to be the surrounding walls next to them. So there's a lot going on here on the reflective surface. However, as I'm using this picture as reference, I'm not going to look at the reflective area as individual objects. Instead, I'm going to look at those reflections as shapes and colors. I also ended up adding random things which weren't in the reference because we do have a different surface area. Mine is a bit wider. But the main idea is to take where the light is coming from, which is where the highlighted area is, and the fact that the left side is slightly brighter in comparison to the right hand side, so the right hand side would have more of the darker tones, which I'm still going to alternate in terms of the tonality and color. So from what I've explained earlier, you can see that there's a lot to think about all at once. So for now, as the base color, I just placed down random reflections and not thinking too much about the value yet. However, if you can multitask all at once, you can place down the values at the beginning stage as well. I just want to make sure that the area of the highlight is very clear, so I won't be painting over it on this next layer where I'll actually be adding the darker values. So on this layer, you can see I'm using the dark mix from Sepia, New Gamboge, and Crimson Lake to paint on the dark reflections on the left and right side of the kettle. Here I added some reflections at the bottom to suggest the reflection of the floor, and this is to also increase the amount of midtones. Next I'll be working on the spout. Just like the body of the kettle, I first painted on the area of the highlight using a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark and New Gamboge. And I just made some things up using the two color mixtures that we used earlier for the body. I want the bottom to have the darker values, but I also want to use the darker value just to add a bit of outline at the top part of the spout to define the shape. When I was painting this, I quite like how the reflections look, and this is where I realized that maybe painting on straight lines on the body as reflections will make the surface look shinier and more metallic, but it was a bit too late for me to fix now, so I decided to just go with what I have already painted. But of course, this is something for you guys to keep in mind and something that you might want to try to apply to your own painting. So from here, I pretty much just painted random wavy lines for the rest of the kettle using the same method and color mixtures because the reference image only has one cylindrical face. So here I just tried to make all the reflections and area of highlights and values to be cohesive with what I've already painted on the body. The only difference for these different faces are the curvature. This time the reflections would follow the surface area of the neck, lid, and everything else in this kettle. So I'm going to paint the reflections according to the cross contour lines of those specific areas. After I painted on the neck, I went back to paint the body. I felt like the midtone was a bit too light and it's getting mixed with the area of highlights, so I just glazed on more of those midtones. As for the lid, I simplified my way of painting. I painted on the midtone color for the rest of the white area while avoiding the highlights and still painting on one area at a time to keep the different surfaces separate. Then I dried everything off using a hairdryer to make it quick and add on the details of the reflection using the dark brown mix. Because I am painting on smaller areas, I switched to my small brush to make it easier to paint the tiny details and thin lines. I like to switch back to the mid-tone brown too sometimes, or even mix the two tones together. And I would paint this fairly thick in terms of consistency to make sure that the lines or the reflections are still visible against the base color. If the lines from the reflections are a bit too defined in certain areas, I would go back in with a clean damp brush to blur out the edges. And once everything is completely dry, I like to go back in using the dark brown to paint a little bit more detail, especially on the edges of the left and right side. This is not necessary, but I felt like I needed to separate the rims of the lid, so I ended up using bleed-proof white in a thin consistency to line the rim next to the dark lines I painted. Next, I'm going to work on the copper handle. I first lined the edge using a thick consistency of a mix between the dark brown and the mid-tone brown, and I'm doing this for both the left and the right. This is so the inner face and the outer face becomes a bit more clear for me to look at. As for the color, I used the mid-tone brown to paint the bottom and the top part, and then where the white area is, I just use a clean damp brush to pull from both of the colors so there's a subtle gradation. Then to increase the reflective surface, I add more of the mid-tone brown as well as the dark brown in a slightly thicker consistency in smaller areas. For the top part of the handle, I want it to be white, so to give it form, I would use gray of gray, especially on the curvy areas. I use a medium consistency for the center curve and a very thin consistency at the bottom and top part of the handle so it looks round. After that, I use a very thin consistency of the mid-tone brown mix to glaze over the bottom and top handle because the gray was a bit too cold in comparison to the copper, which will also reflect the color on the white handle. And after that, I also use a slightly thicker consistency to outline and define the shape. To darken and blur out the detail on the right hand side of the kettle, I decided to glaze over a bit of indigo to make the shadow cooler than the rest of the copper on the left side. And I find that this indigo also helped make the color of the copper pop out a little bit more. When I was looking at the reference, I felt like the highlighted area was much lighter in comparison to the rest of the surrounding area, whereas mine has less contrast, so I decided to glaze over a thin consistency of bleed-proof white to lighten the color and adjust the yellows again on top of it. This will depend on the current stage of your painting though. If your highlighted area doesn't look as dark as mine, you can skip this step. The next thing I'm going to work on is the napkin. I'm going to paint the base color first using a mix of buff titanium and Jaune Brilliant Dark. I want the surface to be completely dry before I add on the shadow, so you can use a hairdryer to make the process quicker. As for the shadow on the side, I use the same mix with added sepia. For the shadow of the folds, I used the exact same color mixture, but this time in a very thin consistency. I don't want the cloth to look too dark, so it's always best to use a thin consistency and slowly build up the value. Once I've placed down the area of the shadows, now I'm going to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency to paint it on the deepest parts of the curves. I'm also going to do the same thing to paint on the details of the layered napkin that is visible from the side. Next, I'm going to paint the surface of the table. For this, I use sepia, but I like to alternate the color and also mix this with a little bit of new Gamboge for a slight change in hue. The reason why I'm not using similar colors to the copper is so the surface of the table and the kettle can stay separate. So here I'm using a completely different tone of brown that is much more muted in comparison to the Kettle. This way it will also send the color more to the back, whereas the Kettle will pop out more. Since the shadow is coming from the right hand side, I'm going to layer on a slightly thicker consistency of the same color. Just on the right hand side and at the bottom below the napkin, I'm going to use a very thick consistency and soften the edges. After that, I'm going to go back to the napkin again. I'm going to paint on the pattern or the design of the napkin. For this, I use yellow from a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark, New Gamboge, and a little bit of Crimson Lake to make a deeper tone of yellow. And as you can see, I'm just painting on lines, but I'm following the curvature, and this will help give more form to the napkin. I'm going to wait for the yellow to dry off. Meanwhile, I'm going to darken the surface on the right hand side and also darken the right hand side of the background slightly. For the surface, I added Crimson Lake to the sepia because I suddenly thought that areas in shadow tend to look more flat as it's covered by a darker value. So I decided to warm up the dark brown, specifically on the right hand side. As for the background, I used the same mixture as the base color, but I added a bit more sepia to darken it. After that, I want to balance out the shadow of the napkin, especially on the right hand side. I ended up using a mix of buff titanium and sepia for this, and by doing this I would also cover parts of the yellow lines, so I will paint the lines again, this time using a darker value with added sepia to the mix. Lastly, I'm going to paint on the highlights, and this is not the highlight from the surrounding reflection, but highlight as in the light reflection on the metal. For this, I use bleed proof white, and I like to add it on curvy areas of the kettle. After that, I'm just going to do some final touch-ups to balance out the overall value as well as define the forms again. So that's pretty much it for this painting. This was definitely a tough one for me to paint, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like usual, all the list of tools that I use for this painting will be in my description box, along with my social media links and the link to this outline for my coffee shop. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!